Suspended and fined a fortnight's pay, Van Hooijdonk resolutely refuses to budge from his home in Holland. Disenchanted, he says, with Forest's failure to buy big following promotion.
I said, when you get married, you sign a contract as well. But after three months, the marriage can be over. The love can be over.
Welcome to a Forest Ramble podcast extra. We're here to talk about something that's significant, not just in Forest football history, but arguably in football history in the modern era. And we're going to talk about it being 20 years since Pierre van Hooijdonk went on strike at the City Ground. Also, that obviously marks 20 years since Forest got relegated from the Premier League for the last time. So it would be a nice symmetry if Forest can actually get back in the Premier League this year, I think. I am joined by the Maradona in the Midlands, hello.
Hello.
And by Steven Toplis, hello.
Hello.
All right, Steven, so give us a little bit of background. Tell us about how Van Hooijdonk ended up coming to the club in the first place.
Yeah, he came in March 1997. We signed him from Celtic. It was $4.5 million that we paid for him, and at the time that was a club record transfer fee. And
Stuart Pearce was the team manager at that point, but Dave Bassett was the general manager.
Yeah, and this was in the March, so with 2 months left of the season, there was still a chance that Forest, who at the time were battling relegation from the Premier League, there was still a chance that we could get out of trouble and stay up.
Okay, trivia time. Pierre van Hooijdonk, in that tail end of that season, wore number 15. Who was the previous incumbent of the number 15 shirts?
I think it was Salenzi, wasn't it?
Certainly was, Andrea Salenzi. So we swapped one maverick striker for another. Okay, so he came to the club. I think it's fair to say that he didn't do a huge amount as Forest toiled away against relegation that season.
No, he scored 1 in 8 at the back end of that season, but the team wasn't exactly playing well, so it was a difficult ask for him to come in and save the season. It was hoped that he would come in and score some goals and get Forest out of danger, but in the end, we were relegated 20th place, bottom of the league.
And if I remember rightly, I think he showed that he had a good touch and everything, but yeah, scoring goals in that team was obviously a step too far. Okay, but then the next season, well, Forest were just magnificent in that season, weren't they? The way that I've described it, Forest were promoted under Dave Bassett. They were super successful. They made promotion look easy, scored loads of goals. They were a little bit suspect at the back, but positively, they ended up being champions more or less by country mile, and just as pleasingly, really annoyed Middlesbrough and Brian Robson. so those are my main memories of the tail end of that season. Now, in that season, Kevin Campbell scored how many goals?
23.
And Van Hooijdonk scored?
34.
Right, okay. So that is, by anyone's standards, a prolific season for a front pair.
Well, it was the first time since the 50s that a Forest front pair had scored more than 20 goals each. And they linked up brilliantly that season. The two of them were fantastic together. And it's easy to forget that before then, Kevin Campbell hadn't really done a great deal in a Forest shirt, and he hadn't delivered in terms of goals. He got a hat-trick at Coventry on the opening day of that relegation season, I remember, but he never really had any consistent goal-scoring form, and it was only in this season when he linked up with Pierre that he was a consistent goal-scorer, but the two of them seemed to bring out the best in each other, and Pierre, you could see, loved playing with him and vice versa, and they were unstoppable at times.
And I think as well that, previously Campbell, there'd been a bit of pressure on him to be a bit of a target man. And I think Pierre's physicality meant that he ended up, he was definitely the number 9, wasn't he? And it meant that Campbell was able to have a little bit more freedom and perhaps, like you say, a little bit less pressure on him. Maradona in the Midlands, what are your memories of that promotion season?
It's just very, very happy memories. We were just sort of blew teams away. We sort of scoring goals from everywhere. Whenever we got a free kick, you sort of more or less knew Pierre van Hooijdonk was going to score. You knew if Pierre didn't score, Kevin Campbell would score. We just had brought in some good players, players that weren't particularly well known, maybe like Andy Johnson. Everybody who we brought in seemed to do well. He's banged in goals from midfield. We had sort of players like Alan Rodgers, bombing down the wings from the full back, and we still had quality players like Steve Stone, Scott Gemmell, Ian Wone was still knocking around at the club, Colin Cooper.
Because of course Psycho left as well that summer. That was the first season without Stuart Pearce at the club, and he went to Newcastle. So yeah, Rodgers came in and he was excellent.
And Jeff Thomas. People forget that he was at Forest, but he was brilliant in his.
And Dave Harry Bassett again. Parallels with the modern day shows that actually a bit of experience in midfield can make a big difference at this level.
And Dave Bassett. Dave Bassett was
a lot of experience in goal.
But do you remember who started the season as the first choice goalkeeper? It wasn't Bassett. Bassett came a bit later.
Well, Crosley was still there, so presumably it must have been him.
Marco Pascalo.
No way. He'd left already, hadn't he?
I know he played the first couple of games that season. They played
No way.
6 games. And do you remember there was a brilliant game early on against Norwich at the City Ground in front of the TV cameras, and he was in goal for that one.
Oh,
yeah.
And I think that's the one, Friday night where Forest went behind, and then Campbell scored with the ball coming over his shoulder, and he chested it down and volleyed it top corner, and I think Pierre got on the score sheet as well that game.
My main memory of Friday night football that season was Steve Stone's miss. That was
at Reading,
that's
sent off, and Steve Chettle ended up in goal as well.
Yeah, and of course the red card for Besson got rescinded, but too late. I mean, in that respect, if you're a Forest supporter and you haven't seen the Steve Stone miss, check it out on YouTube, because it is one of the best misses of all time. It knocks Ronnie Rosenthal into a cocked hat. So that season, I think we can agree, was really very positive. Now, I'm just going to throw something out there. Van Hooijdonk hit 34 goals with a few matches still to go, and everyone's talking about, could he break the all-time Forest goal-scoring record of one Wally Ardron, who I think got 36 in a season? And you know what? I don't think Pierre was that bothered.
Maybe not. I can't remember that clearly now. I do remember the last few games were tough. They were sort of struggling to get over the line. I think the game that we finally clinched promotion was Reading at home.
Yeah,
on a Sunday.
Well, technically, Forest were promoted and then made champions without even playing, because that Reading match, the winning goal in stoppage time. And again, if you're too young to remember it, then check it out on YouTube, because it was a real kind of. The board went... Well, they didn't even have a board then, did they? It was just like a number on a stick saying 4 minutes of stoppage time, and then Forest scored after that with Chris Bart-Williams.
Brilliant goal as well, where he took the ball down the box, almost did a Cruyff-like turn, and then drilled it bottom corner.
Fabulous composure from a player who was finally showing what a good player he was. So that was brilliant.
And the scenes at the end when Bassett's jumping down the touchline and the fans come on the pitch at the final whistle and so celebrating, that was brilliant. So
Forest were all promoted, but mathematically it was actually clinched during the week after that, with matches involving Sunderland and Middlesbrough and so on, and then the championship was clinched without Forest even kicking a ball. So there's some famous parallels there with times gone by as well. So Forest are promoted. Happy days. We had a little parade around the market square, and me and my dad went there and we waved our flags and stuff like that. And I was at university at the time and went around pleased as punch and wearing my Forest colours, despite the funny looks from other people. So happy days. The summer that followed became slightly less happy.
Yeah, all the optimism that had been built up over the course of that summer slowly wore away. I remember the alarm bells ringing when the club sold Kevin Campbell to Trabzonspor in Turkey. They got £2.5 million for him, which for a 28-year-old was good money. But the form he was in, it was the best spell of his Forest career, and we sold him allegedly behind Dave Bassett's back. He was on holiday and had no idea, apparently.
And I think that was really the thing that is interesting that came out, wasn't it? Because that's a sign that all is not well behind the scenes.
Yeah. And then you had Pierre van Hooijdonk more or less phoning Kevin Campbell as he's about to leave the country, saying, "So is it true that you're leaving then?" Campbell says, "Yeah, it is." And if you're Van Hooijdonk, you are going to be annoyed by that, because the two of them were a fantastic partnership, and they would have. Well, I would have loved to have seen how they'd gotten in the Premier League together. I certainly don't think Forest would have been in the trouble that they were the season that they came up.
Well, the other phrase that we hear a lot in this day and age is player power. But I think back then, it's worth remembering that if the club sold you, you kind of went.
Yeah, you didn't really have much say in the matter, and it was poor from the club, and it wasn't the only poor decision that the hierarchy made. I think it was who was in charge at the time? It was Irving Scholar and Nigel Ray and
Phil Saw as chief executive.
Yeah,
they really, really sold the club down the river with that summer. I don't know what they were looking back at now. I just don't know what they were thinking. It was not just Kevin Campbell, but Colin Cooper was sold as well to Middlesbrough.
Yeah,
and so that was more or less the spine of our team gone, as our leader at the back and one of our top goal scorers.
Yeah, the club captain to be sold, like that as well. When you've gone up, you have to build upon the good stuff that you've got there. And Forest were just dismantling it.
Yeah, and I think that was due to a gentleman's agreement that Cooper had with Dave Bassett, that if Middlesbrough came in for him, Forest would sell him. So I think Middlesbrough was the only club that Cooper would leave Forest for, and as it happened, they made a bid for him and he went. But I remember being gutted when we sold Cooper. Absolutely gutted.
I mean, he was my favourite player. I was devastated.
He was the leader of the club.
And the fact that Forest did so well, losing the strongest leader in recent times with Stuart Pearce, probably speaks volumes about Colin Cooper taking over the captaincy, because I think it's only when you kind of read sorts of books about autobiographies and so on, books about what football was like in those days, you realise what a strong influence the captain has in the dressing room. So to lose the captain like that, and Steve Chettle, God love him. I mean, I think everyone thinks well of him, and apparently he's a really good guy, but he never came across as being that sort of strong, feisty leader that you kind of want. And he ended up kind of assuming the club captaincy like almost by osmosis because of that change.
And what I remember about Colin Cooper being sold is it must have been on East Midlands Today or Central News. A mother was deeply disappointed by it because she just bought a kid the new Forest shirt with Cooper 4 on the back, and days later it had been sold. So she was trying to get the club to give her a refund for the shirt. But this is a small example of of how disappointed the fans were by that, and how out of the blue that transfer came about.
You know what? Actually, I do remember going into the club shop just after Campbell had been sold, and they were saying that they were getting ready to print off loads of Campbell 10 shirts. So they didn't know about it either. And they were just like, no, we didn't know it was going. No, usually you get an idea, you get an inkling of what's going on. We didn't know. And so we were just going, okay, well, this is before it kind of emerged that Dave Harry Bassett didn't know about it. And we're going, well, at least we've got a good manager, someone who's got experience of kind of doing a backs-to-the-wall fight in the Premier League and so on. And then it came out that Pierre had, gone.
Yeah, and it's the other thing worth mentioning going on in that summer, Scott Gemmell was dropped from the first team for refusing to sign a new contract, so another important player being alienated somewhat by the board and the club. And just on top of the point you're making there with Pierre, he allegedly brokered a deal for his Holland teammate, Wim Jonk, to come and join Forest. Now, the two of them had played together that summer for the Netherlands at the World Cup, which is worth mentioning because of Van Hooijdonk playing that well. He got into a World Cup squad and scored in that World Cup against South Korea. So he allegedly brokered this deal for Wim Jonk to come to Forest. And I remember reading about it at the time thinking, oh yeah, Wim Jonk in Forest midfield, that sounds great. And it didn't happen. And he eventually went to Sheffield Wednesday. So maybe that, on top of all the other things that were going on, there was also rumours that Pierre had been promised a transfer away if a big enough club came in for him, and enough money was put on the table, but apparently the Forest board went back on that promise. So all those things came together, and then Van Hooijdonk decides, I've had enough of this, I'm walking out, I'm going
where did
on
he
strike.
go?
Well, he went back to Holland, and he trained with Nac Breda, one of his former clubs, so he kept his fitness up there, but he refused to come back to Nottingham, and made it clear in press conferences and interviews that he was not going to return to Forest. And this was before the season had kicked off. So we're going into the new season without our talismanic striker and our best player.
And I remember the squad list being announced with a big gaping hole at number 9. What was the reaction of Dave Harry Bassett?
I think he was fuming.
He wasn't shy about saying it either, was he?
And I think the whole club, the whole fan base, everybody was.
Well, players and management alike read in Nottingham, the Evening Post. I think it was disbelief which led to people actually venting out loud in a way that is quite unusual.
Even Steve Stone waded into the argument. I remember he didn't hold back with his thoughts on it. And yeah, the players turned on Pierre, the fans turned on Pierre, and obviously the management and the club hierarchy did. And he was made out to be the bad guy in all of this.
I think nobody had ever heard of anything like it before.
Well, it was unprecedented. Certainly in English football, we'd never seen anything like it.
And in the meantime, the season started, and Forest had added a striker, Jean-Claude Dutchman. Yeah, remember him? And then Dougie Freedman signed at some point along there as well. You lose, like you say, a World Cup international goal scorer, and you sign like a really quick lad from France who couldn't hit a cow's arse with a banjo.
Well, the thing was that it was not only that had they sold the players, they weren't providing any sort of real transfer funds either to Dave Bassett to bring in the sort of players he would have wanted.
And the players who were there were getting really unsettled by this. You use the example of Gemmell. Let's not forget, just to take a step away from that and take a step forward in time, by the end of that season, Gemmell, Stone, a few others had all gone.
Yep.
Yeah.
And most of them had moved because Forest just had to cash in before they moved under freedom of contract. So the negotiation skills within the club were really not what they should be when you're going up.
I think there was just terrible mismanagement. We thought Fawaz did a bad job, but these guys gave him a good run for his money. And just going back to Darshville, the sort of players we were bringing in were just sort of more or less desperation signings, right at the end of just before the season started. These players we couldn't buy them for any real money, and just sort of finding players like. To be fair to him, the first game was Arsenal away, and Darshville looked really good, and we thought, oh wow, Harry's done it again. He's found a diamond, but he never.
Gave Keane the runaround in that game.
He did. He looked really, really good. He looked really quick, and but he never really fulfilled that potential.
I think the problem with Darshville as well, he had personal issues going on. I think his wife and kids had died in a car crash just before he joined Forest. So. If you can understand if his head wasn't in the right place to play football.
Yeah, and certainly I don't think any of us are criticising him. It
was just unfortunate that he was thrown into a situation where we're almost relying on him to be the source of goals out of desperation.
I think it's actually absolutely fair that you pointed out there was a real terrible personal tragedy behind that, wasn't there? And so he, moved country to kind of try and form a new life for himself, and that's why maybe he looked so good in those first few games. He wanted to make a good impression. He's playing to try and not forget. That's the wrong phrase, but to try and heal himself.
Yeah.
And so naturally enough, it's not surprising when you think that the whole weight of the situation took its toll on him, and he ended up leaving before the season was even out.
And I remember he scored, I think it was the second game of the season away at Southampton, and we won, and Darshville scored in that one. And then we beat Coventry at home, Steve Stone scoring. And at that point, Forest, after 3 games, were third in the table, and they'd done okay. And I can always remember, because this was a game that I went to, Everton at home on a Tuesday night. Had Forest won that game, they'd have gone top of the Premier League. And as it happens, they lost 2-0, and it was a bit of a drab affair.
And then the season was over.
Yeah, the slide just seemed to, to start from there.
In the meantime, the number 9 shirt had been filled. Welcome, Neil Shipley. And that's a sign of Dave Harry Bassett doing the Dave Harry Bassett job. He's going for a player he knows, he's doing a bit of wheeling and dealing, signed a player for £1 million who was nowhere near as good as the player who... really, Pierre's market value at that stage, bearing in mind 20 years ago, was probably in the region of probably 6 or 7 million. And so we were scrabbling around with relative peanuts. And again, at a time when a club's just been promoted, you invest, you don't asset strip, and that's what the management were doing.
I think it says a lot when you're finishing one season with Kevin Campbell and Pierre van Hooijdonk up front, and then you're starting the next with Dougie Freedman and Neil Shipley as your,
Yeah.
your strikers. So it just shows you where the club had gone wrong.
And it shows you how bad he was when his own Forest fans were singing, you couldn't score in a brothel to Neil Shipley. So, we were in trouble.
We were in trouble. Okay, and time ticks on, and Forest, after a promising start, the weight of the Premier League is getting on them, things are sliding a bit. Pierre comes back.
Well, the rumour was that Irving Scholar had gone over to Monaco to speak to him, and I think Pierre says this. He eventually agreed to come back to Forest because Forest said that they would sell him. And there was an agreement put in place that when a good offer comes in, we will sell you. So Pierre agrees to return. Interestingly, Dave Bassett, reflecting on this a few years later, said, I probably should have been a bit more diplomatic in how I handled it. I was quite aggressive and dismissive of Pierre, and I didn't want anything to do with him, and I felt he'd let me down.
And I think it's worth, that's something I do remember, is he basically more or less said in the media, don't really want him back, but he's here now.
Yeah. But Bassett said, I needed results, and I probably should have gone over to Holland and spoke to him and tried to stop the situation getting out of hand.
But how do you handle an unprecedented situation, even if you're a manager with as much experience and as much kind of backs to the wall mentality and experience as Dave Harry Bassett? How do you deal with that?
Well, players weren't mollycoddled in that way at that time. Not the way they are now. It was, you did what the manager told you to do. Especially it was like an old-fashioned manager like Dave Bassett, who just commanded respect wherever he'd been, and sort of for him it was an unprecedented situation. He would have normally just told a player to
go and do one.
Yeah.
And I think that thing about respect, when Dave Harry Bassett came to Forest, we were quite sceptical as fans, but he earned that respect.
Yeah, I think I was actually really, really pleased. I remember because I always thought he was really underrated as a manager. I was really, really pleased.
Well, people were sceptical about the style of football, weren't they?
But I think I was delighted. I think he was one of the most underrated managers in the country, and for what he produced and that style of play in that Championship, it was good.
Yeah.
It was good to watch. And Dave Bassett was very, very disappointed as well, because he felt Forest was the one opportunity to go to a big club and show what he could do as a manager with better players. And he felt incredibly let down, not only by Van Hooijdonk, but the board as well. They took away that opportunity for him to display it on the Premier League stage with good players, international players, and what he could have achieved.
And the point you made about the interviews he's given in more recent times, it really highlights that, doesn't he? He still feels like he was kind of deprived of that opportunity by the fabric of the club, the sort of hierarchy leading to this situation. And funnily enough, we're talking about our friends over the river at Notts County, and this season they have sacked Kevin Nolan, and then they've sacked Harry Kewell. And I was talking with my father-in-law about it, and he was saying, what about the players? What are the players doing? I said, the trouble with the players is that Notts haven't got as many good players as they did last season, so sacking the manager isn't going to make any difference when the players don't have the ability and when the owner seems to think that he knows better than good football people. And, I drew the parallel. Father-in-law is a long-standing Forest supporter, and I drew the parallel. Just look at 5 years under Fawaz, and look at how nothing that any of those managers could do would have made the blindest bit of difference. Because when things are rotten from the top down, you're up against it. And that's exactly, you made that parallel. Fawaz and the Nigel Ray and Irving Scholar years, they were two sides of the same coin. They manifest themselves in different ways, but two sides of the same coin. And Dave Harry Bassett, what could he do?
Yeah, what could he do?
They undermined him badly when you look back on it. And
I'll just point out as well that summer, just after promotion, Irving Scholar went public to the national press and said, Dave Harry Bassett's got a job here for life.
Yeah.
And then he pulled the rug out from under him.
Into that near post, and it's a goal! And Van Hooijdonk has scored it! Forest, one down, minutes ago, are now in the lead, and Van Hooijdonk has a very private celebration. In fact, the only man who's gone over to him is the scorer of the first goal, Dougie Freedman. One of those decided to bury the hatchet. The rest of them looked as though they'd rather bury it in his back, even though he has just scored the goal. The other players just walked away.
So Pierre comes back, and it's not long before he scores an important goal in an important game.
Yeah, he comes back in that November, 16th of November 1998, and it's Derby County at home.
I think it's actually the Wimbledon game he came back before that. Because I was there, and I had a bit of an anecdote because I was very vocal because I was still seething at the time, and I was standing there booing him in the warm up, and I got into a bit of an altercation with this another Forest fan who said, "We need him more than he needs us," and I was only young at the time, and he was a big birdy bloke, more an ape than a man, really. And I moved at half time, and I was a bit scared of him. but it brought.
He was right though, wasn't he?
Yeah, it was a split though. But I think there's lots of people booing him, and lots of people wanted to show him how they felt about him, and it was But it's bad when the fans are having a go at each other before their game.
Yeah, and if ever there's something that's symptomatic of the state of the club, surely it's that, where the fans are really kind of laying into each other. And also, again, bit of trivia, what squad number did he wear that year?
I've got no idea.
40.
Yeah, so Forest squad numbers went up to about, I think, 28 that season, and then he came back and he wore number 40. And I remember, I can't remember if it was Martin Fisher or Colin Fray saying on the radio, that just shows the arrogance of the man, you know. He should have just Shipley had taken the number 9 shirt, so that wasn't available anymore. But it's just like he chose a number that's astronomical and nothing to do with any of the other. And then he comes back, and then we have the local derby against Derby.
Yeah,
it was live on Sky TV. And Maradona in the Midlands. I was with you when we were watching that on Sky because we were off in other parts of the world at the time.
I've absolutely no memory of it whatsoever, but I can't remember it at all.
Well, the only thing that I remember about it is Pierre scored. He scored a header from a corner. The corner was taken by Scott Gemmell, if I remember rightly. At which point, pretty much the entire Forest team ran over to Scott Gemmell to celebrate with him.
Yeah, the only two that went to Van Hooijdonk was Thierry Bonalaire and Nigel Quasi.
Oh, Lord, I'd forgotten about Nigel Quasi.
He came in that summer as well, didn't he? He was another one of those signings that was a bit underwhelming.
I think a bit.
To be fair to him, he was highly rated at the time, but he never did it at Forest. But
no.
But looking back at the game, I looked back on the internet to refresh my memory because I honestly can't remember any of that period very well at all. But the interesting thing I thought was that the crowd at that game was only about 24,000, and I think it shows how little the derby really meant at that time compared to what it does now. I remember talking to people recently about how it never used to be such a big thing, and we didn't really hate Derby that much at the time. We used to sort of see Derby and Leicester as sort of Forest's little cousins or brothers, and we were quite pleased when they did quite well and when Forest did quite well, as long as they weren't doing as well as Forest. And now it's sort of ramped up to such a big game now. That's an interesting side point.
I suspect there's also something in terms of, Forest won. You know, we're in the Premier League, but everything was rotten. So it's not exactly a big incentive to pay your money and go along, is it? So. So it's just an amazing spectacle. You've got this player, multi-million-pound international footballer, scores a goal in one of the big showpiece matches of the season, and all but 2 of his teammates go over and celebrate with the corner taker. It's absolutely astonishing to see. I still to this day don't think I've ever seen anything which is quite like that. I think it's fair to say that Forest were kind of more or less in the mire by that point, weren't they?
Yeah, deep in relegation trouble, and after that game against Coventry, it took Forest another 19 games before they got a win. Ouch. Which shows you how terrible things had gotten, and that's where ultimately Dave Bassett lost his job. I think it was an FA Cup game at home to Portsmouth.
I remember that one. At home to Portsmouth is
Steve Claridge scoring, and that was the final straw.
An abject match, and Forest had injuries, and isn't it funny when teams aren't doing well how they get more injuries? So I remember poor Mathieu Louis-Jean having to fill in at left back and being absolutely given the run around, and Portsmouth being a division below us, and yet Forest never looked like doing anything in that match, and it was the final straw. So Dave Harry Bassett's job for life had become a job for about 6 months beyond that point, and he was sacked rather unceremoniously. And I think, I'm only going from what I remember of the time, the general consensus was, poor guy, what could he do?
And well, yeah, but the worst part of it was that he found out when he came back from his daily lunchtime jog, because he used to go jogging around the River Trent area, and he came back and the Sky Sports reporter was waiting in the car park, and they broke the news to him that he'd been sacked.
No way.
Yeah, and he didn't. The club didn't even tell him, and that's the most shameful episode of the whole thing, really.
Yeah. So job for life being right, we're not even going to tell him, but he's out.
Yeah.
And of course, it went so well after that, because we had the saviour of football coming in to replace him, which was
Big Ron Atkinson. Yeah, but I remember being quite enthusiastic about this at the time. Because
I remember being quite embarrassed at the time.
Yeah, I mean, all right, I know at the time he hadn't had his faux pas on ITV where
but
that was a few years away.
Fairness, he'd built a reputation, hadn't he, at Sheffield Wednesday once, and where else was it?
Coventry.
He'd
gone into
come in as a bit of a troubleshooter, coming in for half a season,
and just keeping teams above the relegation zone, getting them out of trouble.
Never even looked remotely possible.
Yeah,
No.
I mean, I think from memory, I wasn't too enthused about him coming in, but by the end of that season, I mean, I quite liked Ron Atkinson and that team he put together. They just put in a run of about 5 or 6 games at the end of the season where they sort of won a few games.
Well, we were on course to be the worst team in history, and they had to win their last 3 matches to do it, and they did.
Yeah. But Atkinson was always doomed from his first game again at home to Arsenal.
Oh, the PR gaff.
Yeah, and he goes and sits in the wrong dugout. And I was at this game, and I just remember I was in the Brighton Clough stand, so I was as the executive stand, I think it was called back then. And he walks out of the tunnel, and walks and goes and sits in the Arsenal dugout. And I remember people around me saying, "Where's he going? Why is he walking down there?" And then people are knocking on the back of the dugout. It was a clear dugout.
Yeah.
And he sat next to people like Dennis Bergkamp and Carno on the Arsenal bench, and they were looking around going...
He said afterwards, didn't he? I turned around, looked to the bench, and I thought, we've got a better squad here than I thought.
So, yeah, they said, oh, come on.
And of course,
that way,
now the idea of doing that is known as doing a big run, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,
and of course we lost that game as well.
Yeah.
Probably
And,
typical,
okay...
but-
How did Pierre do in the sort of 2/3 of a season that he came back for?
Well, he went on to score 6 goals in 19 Premier League starts, which isn't terrible, but I suppose given the way the team was performing,
yeah, for a relegation team, that's pretty good.
it wasn't too bad. He scored a crucial goal at Everton, I remember. We went up to Goodison Park and won 1-0, and it was Pierre who scored the goal there, and that was when you started to think, oh, maybe we can turn this round. And I think Everton were down there with us, struggling. And the irony is, they signed Kevin Campbell on loan the back end of that season,
which saved him.
He scored something like 8 goals in 9 games and kept them up. So
And they signed Scott Gemmell.
Scott Gemmell,
they did, yeah.
So inadvertently strengthening a relegation rival, and Campbell obviously proved that he had something to offer in the Premier League, and he went on to have a couple of good years at Everton. So again, just shows you really the poor managerial. Sort of
decision
making, that was going on at Forest to get rid of a player who still had so much to offer. And I said earlier on, I think had Campbell and Van Hooijdonk stayed together in the Premier League, we wouldn't have been in the trouble that we were. We'd have been.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we'll never know for certain, but I think it's fair to say that we came up with a stronger squads than we had in the Premier League.
Yeah, and look at Middlesbrough as well. Middlesbrough, they had Colin Cooper in that team now. They finished something like 11th or 12th, and they never looked like going down. And Forest had proven ourselves to be the better team than Middlesbrough the season before, and we never built on that. So again, it felt like a missed opportunity.
Okay. In the least surprising development, Pierre was sold that summer.
Yeah.
To Vitesse Arnhem.
Yeah, Vitesse Arnhem, he moved on for £3.5 million. So in the end, we lost money on him.
Which is about
2 years before.
About half his market value if he hadn't gone on strike, isn't it?
Yeah, and if we'd have sold him before the strike, like you say, £7-8 million we could have got for him, and maybe strengthened the squad to compensate for him leaving. But yeah, it was the end of a sorry saga and
Okay, so
unforgettable time in Forest history, really.
just to put this in context, Maradona Midlands, was Pierre correct to go on strike?
No, he wasn't. It wasn't his position to judge who the signings were coming in or who were being sold. His job was to go there, train hard, and play to his best ability for the team.
Was he right in principle, if not in practice?
No, I don't think so. He's a player. He's not the director of football. It's nothing to do with him. He's just got to go out onto the pitch and play. He was right in no way whatsoever in anything, and we've suffered ever since. We've never really fully recovered from that summer and that season, and we're still down here 20 years later.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's an interesting point. We'll come back to that in a second. Stephen, do you have any sympathy with Pierre for his actions?
I understand why he was frustrated, and he would have felt that the club wasn't showing enough ambition, and I could understand his disappointment. But he went about it in the wrong way. You don't go on strike. You don't let your teammates down. You don't let the club down, and you don't walk away when times are hard. And that's what sticks with me. That he walked away when Forest needed him, and if he'd have come in and performed, he would have got his move anyway. Somebody would have come in for him, and he'd have got his move away, and he'd have been happy. In the end, he did as much damage to himself that season as he did the club. Probably a bit more to the club, but you know the point that I'm making. But it's interesting that in the years that have followed, he's been asked about this, and he's not particularly complimentary of Dave Bassett, but he does say things could have been handled differently. So I think there are elements of that now.
And it's interesting because I think, at the risk of making a sweeping generalisation, the Dutch national psyche is that Dutch people do say what they think. And we've seen enough examples of that in the Dutch national team every time they implode at a World Cup, because they tend to say what they think and then fall out with each other. It's interesting that, all he was doing was saying what he was thinking. But in terms of the consequence of this, we've touched upon it already, was this a watershed moment in terms of player power?
Maybe, but I think the Bosman rule with the freedom of contract and just the money they earned in later years, that's more of a factor.
One thing that I do remember hearing at the time that he signed for Forest was that he left Celtic because he wasn't happy with the new contract that was on the table. And I can't remember exactly what the figures were. I think it's about 11,000 or 12,000 or something like that per week. And I remember him saying something to the effect of, 11,000 per week might be enough for a homeless person, but it's not enough for Pierre van Hooijdonk. Now, this is post-Bosman, when it meant that players were able to start reaping the rewards through signing on fees and better wage deals and so on. So, Stephen, was it actually maybe symptomatic of the beginning of the end of it being the managers and the clubs that had the upper hand?
Yeah, I think it was an indicator of what was to come with player power. There've been examples down the years where players have made it clear that they're not happy with things that managers are doing or the way that things are panning out for their team. I think Carlos Tevez had a bit of a sulk a few years ago with Mancini, and that drew parallels to what happened with Van Hooijdonk. I think it's worth mentioning as well, because I always believed with the Van Hooijdonk strike, he thought that the fans would get behind him. By going on strike, he would show the fans. Good guy. Yeah, he'd be the good guy, and he would show the fans, this is how the club's being run, this is what the club's doing, this is what the owners, the chairman are doing to your club. They're running it into the ground, and I'm making a stand. But it never came across like that. Did
we understand that enough about the damage that the ownership were doing to the club?
Not at the time. I don't think there was as much media attention at the time.
I remember people not being massively, or being sceptical about Irving Scholar. I remember as well.
But that was even before he came in, though.
Yeah, and I remember as well that Nigel Ray, it's like, why is he buying a football club? He's a rugby man. And the arguments at the time was, is he coming into asset strip Forest to fulfil his rugby needs? And I think there's possibly a strong argument there.
Yeah. But I just think at the time it all became about Pierre. That was the main factor. And I just I don't know. I don't know why he did it. Well, you just think, what if he had?
Well, no one won, did they?
No one
benefited from it.
No. And it did. It damaged the club and it set the club back, and we've struggled to recover from that season.
But have we learnt anything from it?
Well, I think, if you look at some of the owners we've had down the year, in particular Fowers, no, we haven't learned from bad ownership, because bad ownership will still exist in football.
Does it also show us, with having been topped and tailed by Nigel Ray and Irving Scholar and then Fowers at the other end, that the sort of the Nigel Doughty reign, actually you do kind of want that almost benevolent presence where, you know, someone who actually would rather take a back seat and would rather, he might not have the means or even in some cases and sometimes the ability to run the club to get that level of success. But as long as they are doing it for the right reasons, almost, that's a better sign.
Well, maybe, but I think what you want as a club is somebody who knows what they're doing and will take an active role in doing that, either personally or by the way the new regime have done, putting in a management structure there. We were at the club every day, who know what they're doing, and have sort of reinvigorated it. I think that's what you want. I think neither of the Scholar, Ray, ownership.
Fawaz was down. He made a point of saying about how he took the time out of his other interests and spent a lot of time in Nottingham.
But he didn't know what he was doing.
No.
Yeah, so I think we've got to keep fingers crossed and knock on wood and hope that our current regime can continue their upward trajectory and run it in a professional way, which is the club's been crying out for decades now. So
maybe then the biggest lesson that we've learned is that actually the stewardship of an actual football club is massively important. And again, I guess if you look at modern parallels, you look at the regime at Man City, where they have got an owner who more or less, bankrolls things, but more or less leaves the running of the club to someone who's there on a day-to-day basis. And yeah, sure, they've spent unbelievable amounts of money, but then you compare that to down the road in Salford, and you got Man United, where they've got people who really aren't interested in the welfare of the club, and you look at how they're struggling there. And so it brings me back to that theory that if things are rotten from the top, then everything, there is a trickle down there in terms of, if the roof's falling in, then people on the bottom floor are going to get hurt.
Yeah, I think both those cases, Manchester United, the Glazers, they're just there for the money. And at Forest, Scholar and Ray were just there for the money. There was no pretence that they were there for anything else. There was no love for Forest. So I think if you're just doing it just for the money, there's always going to be that struggle. It's a similar sort of situation at Arsenal with Kroenke. As long as they're turning a profit, he doesn't care if they win anything or not. And it's not about the glory for them. And that's why they're ultimately going to fail in achieving what football's supposed to be about, and that's winning leagues and cups. So overall, this whole sorry saga was a cautionary tale of the evils of modern football. The great white hope that the Premier League era would bring in that new level of achievement and professionalism. Actually, all it's meant is that the money is more important than ever before.
I mean, he can't be complaining with the fact that the club has not got promoted in the years to go, but he affected that club for the next couple of years, in my opinion, by his behaviour. I remember George Graham saying directors direct, managers manage and players play, but, Pierre wanted to be chairman, manager and coach and did decide recruitment.
This has been a Forest Ramble podcast extra. Thanks for joining us. Do remember that if you want to support us, then you can do so by going to paypal.me/forestramble. Do donate and buy us a coffee. Also, do subscribe and leave a review via Apple Podcasts. If you leave a review, it'll help other people to find the podcast. So if you enjoyed it, help other people to find it. Meantime, thanks for joining us.